Cameras flashed like constellations, capturing the city's elite in their shimmering armor of silk and jewels. At the center of it all stood Marcus Thorne, a man forged in the fires of the stock market, his smile as sharp and brilliant as a shard of glass. On his arm was a woman who was not his wife. And across the room, hidden in the velvet shadows, his 6 months pregnant wife, Clara, felt the first quiet tremor of her world preparing to shatter. She watched him laugh, watched him lean in close to the other woman, and knew that the life she had so carefully built was nothing more than a beautiful, gilded lie. The crystal chandeliers of the Imperial Grand Hotel wept light onto the polished marble floors, a cascade of diamonds illuminating the annual Thorne Foundation Charity Gala. It was the social event of the season, a meticulously orchestrated performance of philanthropy where fortunes were pledged and reputations were cemented. From her secluded table in the corner, Clara Thorne watched the spectacle unfold, one hand resting protectively on the gentle swell of her belly. To the outside world, she was the epitome of grace and fortune, the beloved wife of Marcus Thorne, the brilliant, self-made millionaire whose name was whispered with a mixture of envy and reverence. Tonight, however, the gilded cage felt smaller, its bars colder and more constricting than ever before. A familiar nausea, one that had little to do with her pregnancy, churned in her stomach. Marcus was holding court near the entrance, his laughter booming over the string quartet's rendition of a Vivaldi piece. He was a master of the room, his charisma a gravitational force that pulled everyone into his orbit. And tonight, a new celestial body had entered that orbit, a stunning, raven-haired woman in a crimson dress that clung to her like a second skin. Her name was Isabel, and Marcus had introduced her to his inner circle as his newest protégé, a rising star in his acquisitions department. Clara knew a lie when she saw one. She had spent the last 7 years decoding the nuances of Marcus's behavior. She saw it in the proprietary way his hand lingered on the small of Isabel's back, the shared, secretive smiles that passed between them when they thought no one was looking, and the way he angled his body towards her, a subtle but undeniable act of allegiance. Each glance was a tiny, sharp betrayal, a death by 1,000 cuts. Her mind drifted back to a different time, a different life. They had met in a dusty, second-hand bookstore when he was still just a man with a blueprint for an empire and a fire in his eyes. She was a graduate student, buried in literature, finding solace in the quiet worlds of forgotten authors. He had been a force of nature, promising her a life she'd never dreamed of. He had loved her. She was sure of it then. He had cherished her quiet strength, calling her his anchor in the turbulent sea of his ambitions. "You keep me grounded, Clara," he used to whisper, his voice rough with sincerity. "Without you, I'm just a kite in a hurricane." But the higher his kite flew, the more frayed the string became. The quiet evenings they once cherished were replaced by lavish dinners with people whose names she couldn't remember. The bookstore dates became a distant memory, paved over by a life of press releases and photo opportunities. She had convinced herself it was the price of success, a necessary sacrifice for the legacy they were building. The legacy that was now growing inside her. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She clutched the damask tablecloth, her knuckles turning white. She had told him she wasn't feeling well enough to attend tonight, her body aching with the profound fatigue of the second trimester. He had brushed off her concerns with a casual wave of his hand. "Nonsense, darling. It's our biggest night. The press will expect to see you. Just smile and look beautiful. You do that so well." It was a command, not a request, delivered with the same cool detachment he used when ordering his driver. He no longer saw her. He saw a prop, a necessary piece of stage dressing for the grand play of his life. Her attention was pulled back to the present by a sudden surge of activity. The press, who had been kept at a respectful distance, were now swarming towards the center of the room. Marcus was standing on a small, elevated platform, a microphone in his hand. Isabel was right beside him, her expression a perfect blend of demure admiration and triumphant pride. "Friends, colleagues," Marcus began, his voice amplified throughout the cavernous hall. "Thank you all for being here tonight to support a cause so dear to our hearts. As we build a legacy, we must also invest in the future, in new talent." He placed a hand on Isabel's shoulder. "Which is why I'm not only thrilled to announce a record-breaking night of donations, but also to publicly recognize the incredible mind of my newest Vice President of Strategic Development, Isabelle Dubois." A polite, yet confused applause rippled through the crowd. Vice President? She had been his protege just an hour ago. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. This was more than a subtle indiscretion. This was a public anointment. He was flaunting her, testing the limits of Clara's silence, of her dignity. He was replacing her, not just in his bed, but in the narrative of his life, and he was doing it under the blinding glare of 100 cameras. The room began to spin, the faces of the guests blurring into a grotesque swirl of feigned smiles and hungry eyes. She saw them whispering behind their champagne flutes, their pitying glances cutting into her deeper than any scorn. She was the foolish, pregnant wife, a tragic cliché in a designer gown. The weight of their collective judgment, of Marcus's flagrant cruelty, pressed down on her, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she might faint. She had to get out. Stumbling to her feet, she clutched her small evening bag and made her way towards the exit, her movements clumsy and desperate. No one tried to stop her. No one even seemed to notice. She was a ghost leaving her own haunting, the silent, unseen casualty of her husband's spectacular rise and his even more spectacular betrayal. The cold night air hit Clara like a physical blow, shocking the breath back into her lungs. She leaned against the cold stone of the hotel's portico, the distant sounds of the gala, the music, the laughter, the applause for her own humiliation, seeming to come from another world. The city lights blurred into a watercolor painting through her unshed tears. Horns blared on the street below, a symphony of impatience and hurry that felt alien to the profound, silent stillness that had enveloped her heart. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of past and present. She saw Marcus on one knee in their tiny, cramped apartment, the one they could barely afford. The ring wasn't much, a small sapphire he'd bought with the last of his savings, but his promise had felt as vast and solid as the sky. "I will never lie to you, Clara," he had sworn, his eyes earnest and clear. "I will never make you feel small. Everything I build, I'm building for us." Where was that man now? Had he ever really existed, or was he just a mirage she had desperately wanted to believe in? The man in the ballroom, preening for the cameras with his mistress on his arm, was a stranger. A monster wearing her husband's face. He hadn't just made her feel small. He had tried to erase her entirely. A deep, primal fear, colder than the night air, seeped into her bones. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about survival. Her entire life was interwoven with his. Their home, their finances, their social standing. It was all under the name Thorn. She had given up her academic career, her modest independence, to support his dream. She had become a part of the corporate brand, a role she had played with quiet devotion. Now, she realized with sickening clarity, she was a liability he was preparing to liquidate. And then there was the baby, their child. A life created from a love that now felt like a fraud. What would happen to them? The thought of bringing a child into a broken home, into a world of scandal and whispers, was suffocating. She remembered her own childhood, the quiet tension in her house after her father's business failed. She remembered the shame, the constant worry, the way her parents' broken dreams had cast a long shadow over everything. She had sworn she would never let her child experience that. She had craved stability, a safe harbor, and Marcus had promised her an entire ocean. Now she was drowning in it. Panic began to set in, a frantic, fluttering bird in her chest. She couldn't go back to their penthouse apartment. It wasn't a home, just the headquarters of her husband's life. She couldn't call her parents. Their quiet disappointment would be more than she could bear. Her friends were his friends, their loyalties bought and paid for by his generosity. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her trembling fingers fumbled inside her clutch, searching for her phone. Her contact list scrolled by, a collection of caterers, event planners, and society wives. There was no one she could call, no one who would understand. And then her thumb stopped on a name she hadn't expected to see, Elias Vance. They had met a year ago at a tech conference. He was a titan of the industry, a legendary CEO known for his quiet brilliance and unwavering ethics, a stark contrast to Marcus's flamboyant showmanship. Marcus had been dismissive of him, calling him a dinosaur who didn't understand the new rules of the game. But Clara had found herself drawn into a deep conversation with him about non-profit infrastructures. He had listened to her ideas, not as Marcus Thorne's wife, but as an intelligent, capable individual. He had seen the woman she used to be, the one buried beneath layers of social obligation. They had exchanged numbers, with a vague promise to discuss her ideas for the Foundation's outreach programs further. They had spoken only once since, a brief professional call. Calling him felt like a desperate, insane long shot. What could he possibly do? But his name on her screen represented something she desperately needed, a world outside of Marcus's control. He was perhaps the only person she knew whose power and influence rivaled or even surpassed her husband's, but in a completely different sphere. Marcus feared him, she realized. Not his money, but his reputation. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she pressed the call button. It rang twice, the sound echoing the frantic beat of her own heart. She was about to hang up, convinced this was a foolish mistake, when his voice came through the line, calm, steady, and unexpectedly gentle. "Clara, is everything all right?" He sounded concerned, not annoyed by the late hour. The simple question, the genuine note of worry in his voice, was her undoing. A sob escaped her lips, a raw, ragged sound. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Nothing is all right." She didn't have to explain everything. He seemed to understand immediately. "Where are you?" he asked, his tone shifting, becoming more focused, more protective. "The Imperial, the gala. Stay right there. Don't go anywhere. I'm sending a car for you. It will be a black sedan, and the driver will know my name. Don't get in any other vehicle. Do you understand?" His instructions were clear and precise, a lifeline in the chaos of her mind. "Yes," she managed to say. "Good. We'll figure this out, Clara. You're not alone." He hung up, and Clara slid down against the cold stone pillar, the phone clutched in her hand. For the first time all night, a tiny, fragile flicker of something other than despair sparked within her. He hadn't offered platitudes or pity. He had offered a plan, a first step. As she waited in the shadows, watching the endless stream of luxury cars ferry the city's elite to and from their glittering lives, she knew her old life was over. The promise Marcus had made in that dusty bookstore was broken beyond repair. But as the headlights of a black sedan turned the corner, she wondered if, just maybe, a new one was about to be forged. The interior of Elias Vance's car was a sanctuary of silence and soft leather. It moved through the city's glittering streets with a quiet efficiency that was the antithesis of Marcus's flashy, custom-built sports cars. Clara stared out the window, the city lights a smear of neon and gold, her reflection a pale, ghostly image superimposed over the world that was rushing past. The driver, a discreet man in a dark suit, hadn't asked a single question, simply holding the door for her and offering a bottle of water before retreating behind a wall of professional silence. Her mind was a whirlwind. For years, she had accepted Marcus's narrative of their life. He was the visionary, the architect of their success, and she was his devoted partner, the keeper of their home and hearth. He often told her how much he sacrificed for them, working late nights, taking risks, and bearing the immense pressure of his empire. He had framed her life of ease, the charity lunches, the designer wardrobe, the army of staff, as a gift he bestowed upon her. But now, the frame was shattered, and she saw the picture for what it was. It wasn't a gift, it was a cage. He hadn't been sacrificing for them. He had been sacrificing her for his own insatiable ego. She thought of Isabel's triumphant smile. This wasn't a simple, sordid affair. It was a strategic move. Isabel was younger, hungrier, a woman who reflected his own ambition back at him. She was a business asset, a shiny new acquisition he could show off to the world. Clara, with her quiet intellectualism and her burgeoning pregnancy, represented a different phase of his life, the one he was now eager to shed. She was legacy, family, stability. He wanted disruption, adoration, and conquest. The car pulled into the underground garage of a sleek, minimalist skyscraper in a quieter, more refined part of the city. The driver led her to a private elevator that opened directly into a sprawling penthouse apartment. It was nothing like her own home, which was decorated to Marcus's ostentatious tastes with polished gold, heavy fabrics, and modern art chosen for its investment value. This space was different. It was filled with books, comfortable, well-worn furniture, and large windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city, not as a conquest, but as a living, breathing entity. Elias Vance was standing by the window, his back to her. He wasn't in a tuxedo, but a simple cashmere sweater and dark trousers. He turned as she entered, his expression one of deep, empathetic concern. There were no pitying looks, no condescending words. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice as calm and steadying as it had been on the phone. "Can I get you anything? Tea? Water?" She just shook her head, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling suddenly small and exposed. "I'm sorry to have bothered you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know who else to call." "You did the right thing," he said gently. "Please, sit." He gestured to a soft leather armchair. He didn't sit opposite her, in a position of power, but on a nearby ottoman, creating a sense of shared space, of equality. "I saw the announcement online," he said, his voice low. "The promotion. It was a bold move." He chose his words carefully, allowing her to set the emotional tone. The dam of her composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. "He did it in front of everyone," she whispered, the shame of it washing over her again. "He wants me gone. He's just making it so public, so humiliating, that I'll have no choice but to disappear quietly." Elias listened, his gaze unwavering. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply let her speak, giving her the space to voice the ugly, terrifying truth. When she was finished, her words hanging in the quiet air of the room, he finally spoke. "My mother was in a similar position many years ago," he said, his voice taking on a distant, sorrowful quality. My father was a successful man, not on Marcus's scale, but he was powerful in his own world. He controlled everything, her finances, her friends, her life. When he decided he wanted a new wife, he treated my mother like a failed investment. He left her with almost nothing. I watched her struggle, watched her rebuild her life from the ashes, brick by painful brick. I swore I would never stand by and watch that happen to another good person. The confession was unexpected. A glimpse into the heart of a man the world knew only as a reserved, calculating CEO. It forged an instant, powerful connection between them. He wasn't helping her out of pity, or for some strategic advantage against a business rival. He was helping her because he had seen this story before. He knew how it ended if the protagonist was left to fight alone. "Marcus thinks he holds all the cards, Clara," Elias continued, his voice regaining its quiet authority. "Men like him, who build their empires on image and intimidation, have a critical weakness. They are pathologically terrified of being exposed for what they truly are. They can handle a private, messy divorce. They cannot handle a public reckoning." He leaned forward slightly. "So the question is not what he is going to do to you. The question is, what are you going to do to him?" It was a question no one had asked her in years. Her life had been a series of reactions to Marcus's decisions. The idea of taking action, of writing her own script, was both terrifying and electrifying. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice small. "I have nothing. He controls all the assets. Our prenuptial agreement is ironclad. I signed it without even thinking." Elias nodded slowly. Most prenups have clauses. Morality clauses, infidelity clauses. They are often considered difficult to enforce, but a public spectacle like tonight, that changes the equation. But this isn't about the money, is it? It's about your life, your child's life. It's about taking your power back. He stood up and walked over to a handsome mahogany desk. He returned with a slim, leather-bound folder. "Before you came into Marcus's life, you were a brilliant researcher, Clara. You had a fellowship lined up at the National Endowment for the Humanities. You were on a path to a distinguished career." She stared at him, stunned. "How did you know that?" "I make it my business to know who I'm dealing with," he said with a faint smile. "I read your graduate thesis. It was extraordinary." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "That woman is still inside you. She's just been dormant. It's time to wake her up." He placed the folder on the small table beside her. "You have options. More than you think. You can disappear just as he wants. Or you can walk back into that ballroom and remind him, and everyone else, who you are. Not as his wife, but as yourself." She looked from his earnest, steady gaze to the folder. Her heart was pounding, a frantic drumbeat of fear and a wild, unfamiliar hope. For the first time, she saw a path through the darkness, a narrow, treacherous road that did not lead to quiet surrender, but to a destination of her own choosing. The choice, he had made clear, was hers, and hers alone. Clara spent the next hour in the quiet solitude of Elias Vance's study, the leather folder lying unopened on the desk in front of her. It felt like a Pandora's box, filled with possibilities both wonderful and terrible. For years, her life had been defined by a suffocating comfort, a predictable rhythm of social engagements and domestic management. Now she stood on the precipice of the unknown, and the vertigo was dizzying. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the desk, a string of frantic texts from Marcus lighting up the screen. "Where are you? You caused a scene leaving like that." "People are talking, Clara. This is embarrassing. Call me, now." The messages were stripped of any pretense of affection. They were the cold, sharp commands of a man whose control was slipping. There was no apology, no concern for her well-being, only anger at her defiance. Reading them, something inside her shifted. The last vestiges of the woman who loved him, who made excuses for him, crumbled away, leaving behind a harder, clearer resolve. He wasn't just a flawed husband. He was a narcissist, a bully who had mistaken her gentle nature for weakness. With a deep breath, she opened the folder. Inside were not legal documents or financial statements, as she had expected. The first page was a copy of her old graduate thesis, its title page bearing her maiden name. Beneath it were printouts of emails from years ago, the offer for the Humanities Fellowship, a glowing letter of recommendation from her favorite professor, and a congratulatory note from the dean. It was a time capsule of a life she had willingly abandoned, a ghost of the woman she might have become. The next section contained detailed information about the Thorne Foundation, but it wasn't the public-facing brochure of smiling children and grand pronouncements. It was a breakdown of its inner workings, its funding, its board members, and, most importantly, its operational inefficiencies. Elias had highlighted several projects that were underperforming, mismanaged, or existed more for public relations than for actual impact. It was the foundation Marcus had built, but it was flawed, just like its creator. The final document was a single, freshly printed page. At the top, it read, "The Phoenix Initiative, a proposal." It was a detailed, meticulously researched plan for a new, non-profit venture. Its mission was to provide seed funding, mentorship, and legal support for women forced to leave abusive or controlling relationships, helping them rebuild their careers and their independence. It was a blueprint for turning pain into power. It was brilliant. It was everything she believed in. And at the bottom of the page, under the heading Founding Director, was her name. Clara. She finally understood Elias's strategy. It wasn't about a messy, public divorce battle fought in the tabloids. It wasn't about destroying Marcus. It was about building something new. It was about redirecting the narrative. Not as the scorned wife, but as a leader, a founder, a woman of substance reclaiming her own identity. The ultimate power move wasn't to take from Marcus, but to create something he could never touch. She stood up, her body thrumming with a nervous energy that felt less like fear and more like purpose. She walked to the large mirror in the study's adjoining washroom. The woman looking back at her was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and shadowed with exhaustion. But for the first time in a long time, she saw a flicker of the old fire in them. She smoothed her dress, reapplied her lipstick with a steady hand, and tucked a stray strand of hair back into her elegant chignon. She was putting on her armor. When she emerged from the study, Elias was waiting. He held out a hand, not to take hers, but to offer her the folder. "It's a bold idea," he said, his gaze searching hers. "It will require courage." "He left me with no other choice," Clara replied, her voice low but firm. She took the folder. "He expects me to run and hide. He expects tears and hysterics. He won't be expecting this." "No," Elias agreed, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. "He won't." He glanced at his watch. "He'll be making his keynote address soon, the grand finale of his triumphant evening." "Then I suppose we shouldn't be late for the performance," Clara said, a wry, humorless smile touching her lips. The ride back to the Imperial Grand Hotel was different. The silence was no longer one of sanctuary, but of anticipation. It was the quiet of a storm gathering force just over the horizon. When they pulled up to the grand entrance, the valets and doormen stared, their expressions a mixture of surprise and confusion. The disgraced wife had returned, and she was not alone. On her arm was Elias Vance, a man whose quiet presence commanded more respect than all of Marcus's blustering bravado. They walked through the grand lobby, a wake of whispers and turning heads following in their path. The air crackled with sudden tension. Clara kept her head held high, her eyes fixed forward, her hand resting on her belly. She was no longer just a woman. She was a mother protecting her child's future. She was a warrior walking onto the battlefield. As they reached the entrance to the ballroom, they could hear Marcus's voice, amplified and self-congratulatory, echoing from within. And it is this commitment to family, to legacy, and to building a better future that is the cornerstone of the Thorn Foundation, and indeed the cornerstone of my life. Clara paused, her hand on the ornate brass handle of the door. She looked at Elias, a silent question in her eyes. He simply nodded, a look of unwavering support on his face. He was her ally, her witness. But this was her fight. She pushed the door open and stepped back into the lion's den. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Every head turned towards the entrance as Clara and Elias stepped into the light. The change in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and palpable. The polite murmur of the crowd died away, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. On the stage, Marcus faltered mid-sentence, his practiced, charming smile freezing on his face. His eyes locked on Clara, then flickered to the man standing beside her. Raw, unfiltered shock registered first, quickly followed by a dark, possessive fury. For a moment, the world seemed to move in slow motion. Clara could see every detail with crystalline clarity, the way Isabel's hand tightened on Marcus's arm, her mask of triumph slipping to reveal a flash of insecurity. The greedy, excited glint in the eyes of the journalists, who were already raising their cameras. The shocked, fascinated faces of the city's elite, who were witnessing the implosion of the perfect power couple. Marcus recovered quickly, his media training kicking in. He gave a tight, forced laugh. "Ah, there you are, darling," he said into the microphone, his voice dangerously smooth. "I was getting worried. Had to get some air, I assume?" He was trying to reclaim the narrative, to paint her as an emotional, unstable, pregnant woman. But Clara didn't follow his script. She didn't rush to his side or shrink under the weight of 1,000 stares. Instead, she began to walk slowly and deliberately towards the stage, Elias a half-step behind her, a silent, immovable guardian. She didn't look angry or hysterical. She looked serene, her composure an unnerving counterpoint to the raw tension in the room. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Clara, what do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his voice low enough that only those on stage could hear, but the microphone picked up the menacing edge. He took a step forward, as if to intercept her, to physically remove her from his spotlight. It was then that Elias moved, not towards Marcus, but simply positioning himself at the foot of the small stage, a subtle but unmistakable barrier. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His presence alone was a checkmate. Elias Vance was not a man to be trifled with, and his silent support for Clara sent a clear message to everyone watching. She was not to be touched. Clara stopped directly in front of the stage, looking up at her husband, the man she once loved, the father of her child. She felt a pang of sorrow, not for the life she was losing, but for the man he had failed to become. "You were talking about legacy, Marcus," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the dead silence of the hall. It was steady, devoid of the tears he expected. "You were talking about family and building a better future." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I remember when we used to talk about those things, in our first apartment, when all we had was a dream and each other. You promised me a partnership. You promised me a life built on trust." Marcus's face was a thundercloud. "This is neither the time nor the place, Clara. On the contrary," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "I can't think of a better place. You've gathered all these wonderful people here to celebrate your legacy. It seems only fair that they understand its true foundation." She held up the leather folder. It felt heavy in her hand, the weight of her past and her future contained within its pages. "For 7 years I have stood by your side. I have been your partner, your confidant, and the director of your foundation's charitable programs, a role I took on with pride, even as you began to see me as just another one of your decorative assets." Her gaze flickered to Isabel, a cool, dismissive glance that held no jealousy, only a profound sense of pity. "Tonight," Clara continued, her eyes finding Marcus's again, "you made it clear that my role in your life and in this foundation is over. And you're right. It is." A gasp rippled through the audience. Marcus looked as if he'd been struck. This was not the groveling, heartbroken wife he had anticipated. This was a stranger. You see, a legacy built on lies and disrespect isn't a legacy at all. It's just a house of cards, and I will not have my child's life built on such a pathetic foundation. She placed a hand on her stomach, a gesture of maternal power that resonated through the room. "So I am officially resigning my position at the Thorn Foundation," she announced, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "And I am announcing the formation of my own. It will be called the Phoenix Initiative." She opened the folder and held up the proposal. "Its mission will be to help women like your own mother, Marcus, who was left with nothing, to rise from the ashes of broken lives and build their own futures. It will be a foundation built not on image, but on true strength and integrity." She took a deep breath, preparing for her final devastating blow. "And I'm so very pleased to announce that the initiative has already secured its first round of funding, thanks to my own pre-marital assets, which you so helpfully managed for me all these years, and it has appointed its chairman of the board, Mr. Elias Vance." The shock in the room was electric. Marcus stared at Elias, his face a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. He had been outmaneuvered, not by a rival in the boardroom, but by the quiet, pregnant wife he had so carelessly discarded. She hadn't come to beg for scraps from his table. She had come to announce that she was building her own kingdom. Clara turned her back on her husband, on the shattered remnants of his perfectly curated evening, and faced the crowd and the flashing cameras. For the first time all night, she smiled. It was not a smile of malice or revenge. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated freedom. Clara walked away from the stage, each step feeling lighter than the last. She didn't look back. She didn't need to see the carnage she had left in her wake. Marcus's stunned, apoplectic face, Isabel's panicked uncertainty as she realized she had aligned herself with a fallen king, the frenzied press corps who had just been gifted the scandal of the year. The silence that had greeted her entrance was now replaced by a chaotic roar of whispers, questions, and the frantic clicking of camera shutters. Elias met her at the edge of the room, his expression unreadable but for the deep respect in his eyes. He gently placed a hand on her elbow, steering her through the throng of onlookers who parted before them like the Red Sea. He led her not to the main entrance, but through a discreet side door that opened into a private service hallway. Within moments, they were back in the quiet, insulated cocoon of his car, pulling away from the hotel just as the first wave of journalists burst through the doors, their questions swallowed by the night. The car moved through the city, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. Clara stared out at the passing lights, her mind replaying the scene in the ballroom. The adrenaline that had fueled her began to ebb away, leaving a profound, hollow exhaustion in its place. The weight of the past 7 years, of the love and the lies, the hopes and the heartbreaks settled upon her. And then the tears came. They were not the desperate, fearful tears of the woman who had fled the gala hours earlier. These were different. They were tears of grief for the man she had once loved and the life she had thought they would build together. They were tears of release for the shedding of a role that had never truly fit, and they were tears of a fierce, terrifying joy for the unknown future that was now entirely her own. She wept silently, her shoulders shaking, mourning the end of one life and the violent, beautiful birth of another. Elias remained silent, a comforting, steadfast presence beside her. He passed her a handkerchief from the glove compartment, a simple, kind gesture that meant more than any words could say. He let her cry until the storm passed, leaving a quiet, fragile calm in its wake. "He will fight you," Elias finally said, his voice gentle as he looked out at the road ahead. "He won't let this go. His pride won't allow it." "I know," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. "But he's not fighting the same woman he humiliated tonight. She doesn't exist anymore." Back at the Imperial, Marcus Thorne was living through the worst hour of his life. His carefully constructed universe had been detonated, and he was standing at ground zero. After Clara's departure, the gala had descended into chaos. His largest donors were making quiet, hasty exits, their faces unreadable masks of disapproval. His board members avoided his gaze. He tried to laugh it off, to regain control, but his voice was drowned out by the din of speculation. He grabbed Isabel's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Get rid of them," he snarled, gesturing at the reporters. "Say something, a no comment." Isabel looked at him, her beautiful face pale with shock and a dawning, horrified realization. She was not his partner. She was his accomplice. Her promotion was now inextricably linked to his public downfall. She pulled her arm away from his grasp. "This is your mess, Marcus," she said, her voice trembling. "You fix it." With that, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, abandoning him on his sinking ship. He was alone, standing on a stage that now felt like a scaffold. The flashes from the cameras were like accusations, each one searing his failure into the public record. He saw the headlines already forming in his mind. Thorne's empire crumbles, wife's shocking revenge, millionaire mogul humiliated. The legacy he was so obsessed with building had been redefined in the space of 5 minutes, not by a market crash or a corporate rival, but by the wife he had so gravely underestimated. His phone buzzed with a notification. It was the first of many online news alerts. The story was already breaking. The fallout had begun. 6 months later, the opulent, sun-drenched penthouse that had once been Clara's gilded cage was a distant memory. She now lived in a charming, light-filled brownstone in a historic part of the city, a place she had chosen and furnished herself. The walls were lined not with investment art, but with overflowing bookshelves and photographs of the people who mattered. Her parents, her oldest friends whom she had since reconnected with, and Elias. The Phoenix Initiative, once just a proposal in a leather folder, was now a thriving reality. Its headquarters, located in a modest but modern office space downtown, was a hive of activity. Clara, now heavily pregnant and radiating a vibrant, focused energy, was a natural leader. She moved through the office with purpose, her days filled with grant proposals, client meetings, and strategic planning sessions. She had discovered that the skills she had honed as the wife of a CEO, managing complex schedules, negotiating with vendors, and speaking eloquently at public functions, were the very skills she needed to run her own organization. She had been a CEO in training all along. She just hadn't known it. The legal battle with Marcus had been as brutal as Elias had predicted. Marcus had thrown his army of high-priced lawyers at her, contesting the prenup, trying to freeze her assets, and painting her in the press as an unstable, vindictive opportunist. But Clara, with Elias's quiet guidance and a formidable legal team of her own, had refused to break. She fought back, not with mudslinging, but with facts and unwavering dignity. The very public nature of Marcus's infidelity, witnessed by hundreds of the city's most influential people, had made his position untenable. In the end, he had been forced to settle, releasing her premarital assets and providing a substantial, court-ordered trust for their unborn child. He had lost far more than money. He had lost his air of invincibility. His company's stock had plummeted after the scandal, and his reputation was in tatters. Her relationship with Elias had evolved into a deep and profound friendship. He was her chairman, her mentor, and her most trusted confidant. There was an unspoken chemistry between them, a gentle current of affection and mutual admiration, but they never acted on it. Clara needed time to heal, to find her own footing, and Elias, with his innate decency and respect for her journey, understood that. He was content to be the anchor in her harbor, giving her the support and space she needed to become the woman she was always meant to be. One crisp autumn afternoon, a week before her due date, Clara sat in her new office, looking over the application of the first woman who would receive a Phoenix Grant. She was a talented architect who had been forced out of her career by a controlling husband. Reading her story, Clara felt a powerful sense of connection and purpose. This was her legacy. Not a name on a building, but a chain of empowerment, of women helping women rise. Her assistant knocked gently on the door. "A package was just delivered for you. By courier." It was a small, elegant box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a simple, delicate necklace with a small sapphire pendant. It was an exact replica of the engagement ring Marcus had given her all those years ago. Attached was a handwritten note on his personal stationery. "I was wrong," the note read. "I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me. I see that now. The man who gave you the original ring, the one with dreams and a heart, I don't know where he went. I hope, for the baby's sake, you'll let me be a father. I hope one day you can forgive me." Clara held the necklace in her hand, the cool stone resting in her palm. The apology was there, the words she had once longed to hear. But they felt hollow, like a message from a ghost. It was the plea of a man who was mourning his own loss, not the pain he had inflicted. She thought of the journey she had been on, the strength she had discovered within herself, the new life she had built from the ruins of the old one. She didn't feel anger or even sadness. She felt a quiet, resolute peace. She closed the box and slid it into her desk drawer, unanswered. She had already forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own. Forgiveness was the final step in letting go. But letting go did not mean letting him back in. Her future was not a reclamation of the past. It was a blank page, and she was the only one who held the pen. 2 years passed. The Phoenix Initiative grew from a fledgling startup into a nationally recognized force for change, its success stories featured in magazines and news programs. Clara Thorne, she had kept the name, not as a link to Marcus, but as a brand of her own making, a symbol of what she had overcome, was now a respected voice in the world of philanthropy and women's advocacy. Her son, Leo, was a bright, happy toddler with his mother's calm, observant eyes and a smile that could light up a room. He was the center of her universe, a constant, joyful reminder of why she fought so hard for the life they now had. Marcus was a peripheral figure in their lives. He was a father to Leo, as he had requested. He saw him on scheduled weekends, supervised at first, then on his own, as he proved he could be a responsible, if emotionally distant, parent. He was a changed man, quieter, more subdued. The scandal had cost him dearly, forcing a humility he had never known. He and Clara were civil, their interactions focused solely on their son. The fire, both the love and the hate, had long since burned out, leaving only the cool embers of a shared history. Elias remained a constant, steady presence. He was Uncle Elias to Leo, the one who brought him books and taught him how to build magnificent towers out of wooden blocks. His friendship with Clara was the bedrock of her new life. The unspoken question of what if still hung in the air between them sometimes, in a lingering glance or a shared laugh. But there was no urgency. They were building something slow and solid, a foundation of trust and respect that might one day become something more, or might simply remain the most important friendship of their lives. Either way, it was enough. One evening, Clara was putting Leo to bed, reading him a story from a well-worn book of fairy tales. He pointed to a picture of a princess trapped in a tower. "Sad," he said, his little brow furrowed. "Yes, she is sad," Clara said, smoothing his hair. "But you know what? She's also very strong. And soon she's going to figure out how to build her own door and walk right out of that tower." Leo smiled, satisfied with this revisionist ending, and snuggled into his pillow. As Clara watched him drift off to sleep, she thought about the night of the gala. She remembered the suffocating despair, the feeling of being utterly trapped. It felt like another lifetime, a story about someone else. The woman in the ballroom had been a princess, in a tower, waiting for a rescue. But she had learned that no rescuer was coming. True strength wasn't about being saved by a prince. It was about realizing you were your own hero. The pain of her husband's betrayal had not been an ending. It had been a violent, necessary catalyst that had forced her to burn down her gilded cage and rise from the ashes, not as a victim, but as the architect of her own legacy. It was a legacy of purpose, strength, and the quiet, unshakable joy of a life lived on her own terms. Clara chose to turn her deepest wound into her greatest strength. She walked back into the fire not to seek revenge, but to forge a new identity, transforming a moment of ultimate humiliation into a declaration of independence. Her story is one of betrayal, but also one of incredible resilience and the quiet power of reclaiming one's own narrative. And so, we're left to wonder and to ask you, standing in that ballroom with the world watching and your life falling apart, what would you have done?